When Theodore Blackwood became Charleston's most prestigious antique dealer, collectors trusted him to authenticate their most valuable heirlooms. But when his obsession with rare artifacts and mounting debts consumed him, he began murdering clients to steal their priceless collections, turning his antique shop into a tomb filled with blood-soaked treasures. Before we get to this wonderful story, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Now, let's get back to the story. The golden afternoon light streamed through the tall windows of Blackwood Estate Antiques as Theodore Blackwood carefully examined a Civil War-era pocket watch that had belonged to a Confederate general, preparing to authenticate what would become the most dangerous appraisal of his 25-year career as Charleston's premier antique dealer and historical artifact specialist. At 59 years old, Theodore had established himself as the South's most knowledgeable and trusted expert in American historical artifacts, specializing in Civil War memorabilia, colonial furniture, and rare documents that attracted wealthy collectors from across the country who valued both his expertise and his discretion about their acquisitions and sales. Theodore's prestigious antique shop occupied a meticulously restored 18th-century mansion on Charleston's famous King Street, featuring period-appropriate display rooms, climate-controlled storage facilities, and a private appraisal salon where clients could examine million-dollar artifacts in complete privacy. His inventory included some of the most historically significant pieces available outside of major museums, including furniture that had belonged to founding fathers, weapons carried by famous Civil War generals, and documents signed by presidents that made them virtually priceless to serious collectors of American history. The interior of Theodore's shop reflected his encyclopedic knowledge of American antiques and his understanding of wealthy collectors' psychology, featuring museum-quality lighting, custom-designed display cases that showcased each piece like a work of art, and detailed provenance documentation that traced the ownership history of every significant item back to its original owners. His walls were adorned with certificates from major auction houses, photographs of him with prominent collectors and museum curators, and historical documents that authenticated his expertise in American decorative arts and material culture. But beneath Theodore's reputation for scholarship and integrity lay a dangerous obsession with possessing the world's rarest historical artifacts by any means necessary, including systematic murder of clients who owned pieces he coveted for his private collection. "Good afternoon, Theodore," said Virginia Ashworth, his 3 o'clock appointment and an 81-year-old descendant of a prominent antebellum plantation family whose collection of Confederate artifacts was worth approximately $20 million and included several pieces that were considered national treasures by Civil War historians. Virginia had been a client for 12 years, trusting Theodore to authenticate new acquisitions and provide insurance appraisals for her extensive collection of family heirlooms that had been preserved through generations of careful stewardship. "Good afternoon, Virginia," Theodore replied with the refined Southern gentleman demeanor that had made him legendary among Charleston's antiquing elite, who viewed him as both scholar and guardian of Southern heritage. "I've completed my research on your family's collection of Jefferson Davis correspondence, and I have some absolutely extraordinary news about the provenance and historical significance of these documents. The discoveries I've made will not only enhance their monetary value, but will also secure their place in American Civil War scholarship for generations to come." Virginia had become Theodore's most dangerous client, not because of her demanding personality or her extensive knowledge of Civil War history, but because she owned the Ashworth sword, a presentation saber that had belonged to Confederate General Robert E. Lee and was considered one of the most important Confederate artifacts in private hands. Theodore had been obsessing over the sword for years, researching its history and developing an elaborate plan to murder Virginia and claim the weapon for his private collection that was hidden in a secret vault beneath his shop. What Virginia didn't know was that Theodore had already murdered 6 other collectors to steal their most valuable pieces, and that his antique expertise was being used to identify perfect victims whose deaths would provide access to irreplaceable historical artifacts. Theodore's transformation from respected dealer to calculating killer had begun 4 years earlier, when his gambling addiction and cocaine habit had escalated beyond his ability to finance through legitimate business profits. His obsession with acquiring the world's rarest historical artifacts had evolved into a pathological need to possess pieces that no amount of money could purchase, regardless of the cost in human life or moral compromise required to obtain these treasures. His criminal activities had been triggered by his encounter with the Washington desk, a writing table that had been used by George Washington at Mount Vernon and had been brought to his shop for authentication by elderly collector Margaret Morrison. Theodore had become so obsessed with the desk's historical significance that he had murdered Mrs. Morrison during what appeared to be a robbery, then had claimed the desk had been stolen while secretly adding it to his private collection that was hidden in a secure vault beneath his store. The success of his first murder had convinced Theodore that killing clients was not only necessary for acquiring the artifacts he desired, but also provided opportunities to eliminate witnesses who might discover his growing collection of stolen historical pieces and connect him to the mysterious disappearances of several prominent collectors. Over the past 4 years, Theodore had murdered 9 clients using various methods designed to appear as robberies, accidents, or natural deaths, while systematically building the world's most valuable private collection of American historical artifacts through theft and murder. His victims had included Dr. Robert Chen, a museum curator whose collection of Revolutionary War artifacts had been valued at over $30 million. Patricia Williams, a prominent historian who had inherited a collection of Lincoln memorabilia from her grandfather, and Marcus Foster, a tech billionaire whose Civil War battlefield relics had caught Theodore's attention during a routine authentication session. Each murder had been carefully planned to provide Theodore with access to specific pieces he coveted while creating plausible explanations for the victims' deaths and the subsequent disappearance of their most valuable artifacts from crime scenes that appeared to have been ransacked by random criminals seeking easily portable valuables. Theodore, I need to discuss some extremely troubling patterns I've observed regarding several recent deaths among prominent collectors in our community, said Detective Catherine Reynolds of the Charleston Police Department's Major Crimes Division, as she entered Theodore's shop carrying a warrant to inspect the premises and interview him about suspicious activities. Detective Reynolds specialized in investigating high-value theft cases and had developed expertise in tracking stolen historical artifacts through legitimate and black market sales channels. Detective Reynolds' investigation represented an existential threat to Theodore's criminal operation, as her law enforcement expertise and access to stolen artifact databases could connect his shop to multiple murders and thefts. "Of course, Detective Reynolds," Theodore replied, though he felt the familiar surge of anxiety that accompanied any scrutiny of his business activities by law enforcement officers who possessed the training and resources to detect patterns connecting antique thefts to systematic murders. "The collecting community has indeed suffered several tragic losses recently, and I'm always willing to cooperate with any investigation that might help bring closure to these unfortunate cases." Detective Reynolds consulted detailed case files and evidence photographs from multiple crime scenes, pointing to specific patterns in the theft selections that suggested the perpetrator possessed advanced knowledge of historical artifact valuation and significance, rather than the random grabbing typically associated with opportunistic robberies. "Theodore, I've been analyzing several high-profile murders and thefts that have occurred over the past 4 years. And I've discovered some very specific patterns that suggest these crimes were committed by someone with professional expertise in historical artifact appraisal and authentication," Detective Reynolds said with the methodical precision that had made her successful in solving complex theft cases involving cultural property. In each case, the perpetrator demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of which pieces were most valuable and historically significant, while leaving behind items that would appear valuable to amateur thieves, but were actually reproductions or pieces of lesser historical importance. This level of selectivity indicates that the crimes were committed by someone with access to detailed information about the victims' collections and their relative significance to serious collectors. The detective's identification of the sophisticated selection patterns and her recognition of the professional expertise involved confirmed Theodore's worst fears that his criminal methods had been analyzed and connected to his specialized knowledge of historical artifacts and authentication procedures. Theodore's response was swift and desperate as he realized that eliminating Detective Reynolds was essential for protecting his criminal operation and his priceless stolen collection. "Detective Reynolds, I think your analysis is quite perceptive, but I believe you may be overestimating the expertise required to identify valuable historical pieces," Theodore said, while discreetly reaching for a modified letter opener that he kept hidden in his desk drawer for use as a weapon when murdering clients in his shop. Many criminals today have access to internet resources and auction records that would allow them to distinguish between genuinely valuable artifacts and reproductions or common pieces. Perhaps we could examine some examples in my private authentication room where I can demonstrate how even amateur thieves might learn to identify the most historically significant targets. Detective Reynolds agreed to examine Theodore's examples, not realizing that the dealer was leading her into a soundproof room where previous murders had been committed and where Theodore planned to kill the detective before disposing of her body using methods he had perfected over 4 years of systematic killing. Theodore's plan involved striking Detective Reynolds with the weighted letter opener while she was examining historical documents, then staging the scene to appear as if the detective had been killed during an interrupted robbery by unknown criminals who had fled with valuable merchandise. But Theodore's carefully planned murder of the detective was about to be prevented by the unexpected arrival of FBI agents who had been investigating an international historical artifact trafficking ring with connections to Theodore's suspicious activities. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh of the FBI's art crime team had been conducting a comprehensive investigation into international trafficking of stolen historical artifacts and had identified several connections between missing pieces from Civil War battlefields, museum thefts, and recent sales through high-end antique dealers specializing in American historical material. Agent Walsh specialized in investigating cultural property crimes and had developed expertise in tracking stolen artifacts through legitimate and black market sales networks. The federal investigation had been initiated by requests from the National Park Service and Smithsonian Institution, who were tracking artifacts that had been stolen from historical sites, museums, and private collections across multiple states. The investigation had focused on Theodore's shop after discovering that several historically significant pieces had appeared in his inventory shortly after being reported stolen from various sources. Agent Walsh had been conducting surveillance of Theodore's business operations and had observed suspicious patterns in his acquisition methods, client interactions, and the timing of valuable artifact acquisitions that coincided with unexplained deaths among prominent collectors throughout the Southeast. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Special Agent Walsh with the FBI," she announced as she entered the private authentication room where Theodore was preparing to murder Detective Reynolds. "I have federal warrants for your arrest on charges of international trafficking of stolen cultural property, conspiracy to commit murder, and multiple counts of first-degree murder related to your systematic theft of historically significant American artifacts." Theodore's reaction to the federal agent's intervention was a combination of absolute rage and aristocratic indignation as he realized that law enforcement agencies at multiple levels had been investigating his criminal activities and had connected his antique business to international trafficking rings and systematic murder. His carefully constructed reputation as a guardian of Southern heritage had failed to protect him from comprehensive investigation by agencies with expertise in cultural property crimes. "Special Agent Walsh, there must be some serious misunderstanding about legitimate antique acquisition and authentication practices," Theodore said frantically, while abandoning his plan to murder Detective Reynolds and attempting to maintain his scholarly credibility despite the overwhelming evidence against his criminal enterprise. "I am a licensed dealer with 25 years of experience in American historical artifacts and Civil War memorabilia. All of my acquisitions are properly documented and authenticated through established channels that comply with federal regulations regarding cultural property and historical preservation." Detective Reynolds looked absolutely stunned as she realized how close she had come to being murdered by the antique dealer she had been investigating for theft-related homicides. Her criminal analysis had not only exposed Theodore's systematic murder spree, but had also prevented her own death at the hands of a killer who had been using his scholarly reputation to identify and eliminate wealthy collectors. The comprehensive investigation that followed Theodore's arrest revealed the full scope of his criminal empire and the sophisticated international network he had developed to traffic stolen historical artifacts while murdering collectors. Forensic analysis of Theodore's shop and hidden vault revealed an extraordinary collection of stolen historical artifacts worth over $200 million, including pieces that had been reported missing from the Smithsonian Institution, Civil War battlefields, and private estates across the United States. His detailed records showed systematic coordination between client murders and artifact acquisitions, with each killing providing access to specific pieces that he had researched and coveted for his private museum. The investigation also uncovered Theodore's extensive connections to international artifact smuggling rings, forged authentication documents, and money laundering operations that had allowed him to sell some stolen pieces while keeping the most valuable items for his personal obsession. His criminal network included corrupt museum employees, dishonest auction house specialists, and organized crime figures who specialized in cultural property theft and trafficking operations. Most disturbing was the discovery of Theodore's comprehensive research files on prominent collectors worldwide, including detailed information about their artifact holdings, security arrangements, and personal vulnerabilities that he had compiled for future targeting. His expansion plans included systematic elimination of collectors in multiple states to acquire historically significant pieces for a private museum he had been planning to establish using his stolen treasures. Theodore Blackwood was ultimately convicted of 10 counts of first-degree murder, international trafficking of stolen cultural property, money laundering, conspiracy to commit organized criminal activity, and numerous other charges related to his systematic exploitation of collector trust and his theft of culturally significant American artifacts. The conviction sent unprecedented shockwaves throughout the international antique and historical artifact collecting communities, prompting immediate reforms in dealer licensing, authentication procedures, and collector protection protocols. The case became a landmark example of how trusted cultural professionals could systematically exploit their expertise in client relationships to commit large-scale theft and murder, while building criminal networks that threaten the preservation of American historical heritage. Several other antique dealers and auction houses were investigated for similar criminal activities, resulting in enhanced oversight of high-value historical artifact transactions and new requirements for provenance documentation that made it more difficult for criminals to traffic stolen cultural property through legitimate sales channels. Detective Reynolds and Special Agent Walsh received recognition for their collaborative investigation and became specialists in cultural property crime investigation, developing new techniques for identifying artifact trafficking rings and protecting collectors from exploitation by unethical dealers and criminal organizations targeting valuable historical material. Virginia Ashworth and other surviving clients required extensive security consultations and psychological counseling to overcome the trauma of learning that their trusted dealer had been planning to murder them for their collections. The antique industry implemented comprehensive new safety protocols and client protection measures designed to prevent similar abuse of collector relationships and scholarly expertise. The case prompted comprehensive changes in cultural property regulation, including mandatory background checks for antique dealers, enhanced authentication requirements for historically significant pieces, international databases for tracking stolen artifacts, and new reporting procedures for suspicious transactions involving high-value cultural items. Theodore's conviction also led to increased cooperation between international law enforcement agencies investigating cultural property crimes, with new protocols designed to identify and prosecute criminals who exploited legitimate cultural institutions and collector communities to traffic stolen artifacts and eliminate potential witnesses through systematic murder. The antique and broader art industries implemented revolutionary new safety measures, including enhanced security protocols for private viewings, mandatory recording of high-value transactions, comprehensive client advocacy programs, and international tracking systems designed to protect collectors from exploitation by predatory dealers and criminal organizations. 5 years after Theodore's conviction and life imprisonment, the international antique community continued to recover stolen artifacts and implement safeguards designed to protect collectors from dealers who might abuse their positions of trust and cultural expertise for criminal purposes. The antique dealer, who had promised to preserve and authenticate America's most precious historical treasures, had instead used his expertise and position of trust to commit systematic murder and cultural theft on an unprecedented scale. However, his crimes had been thoroughly exposed and his victims had found justice through the dedication of investigators who refused to accept the coincidental deaths of prominent collectors as random criminal activity. Theodore Blackwood's cursed collections had been returned to their rightful owners or cultural institutions, while their former possessor faced life imprisonment without possibility of parole, proving that even cultural professionals who attempted to exploit their expertise for criminal gain could be identified, investigated, and brought to justice when dedicated law enforcement agencies worked together to protect innocent collectors and preserve American historical heritage. The antique dealer's cursed collections had been permanently removed from his criminal possession, serving as a lasting reminder that historical artifacts must be preserved through ethical scholarship and legitimate collecting, not through the blood of innocent victims, and that those who would steal cultural treasures through murder will ultimately face the full consequences of their betrayal of scholarly integrity and human life. Thank you very much for listening. Please let us know what you think of this story in the comments. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any other videos.